Hi, everyone. I wanted to talk to you today about something that you might find very surprising in terms of the internment during World War II. Most of you are very familiar with the fact that Japanese Americans were interned. About 110,000 in total were interned. They were moved out of the Western Defense Command area towards internal and interior kinds of camps, places like New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, the Dakotas, Colorado, places like that. But one camp that you may not have heard of was called the Family Internment Camp at Crystal City in Texas, which had not only Japanese Americans, but also Germans, German nationals, German Americans, and some Italians and Italian Americans. So let's get into that and find out what really happened there. So after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States then declared war on Japan the following day, and then Germany declared war on the United States very soon thereafter. I believe it was December 11th, and as a result, and of course Italy being part of the Axis powers also declared war in the United States. So that meant that the United States was going to be fighting a two-front war, one on the European side, one on the Japanese side. But it also meant that the people who were from those countries might become scapegoats, such as had happened with the Japanese. So the question really is, though, why? What was going on with that? So there was some concern, of course, with the issue of motivations of certain people who were still citizens of those countries. So that became a motivation for the American government to intern them. So before we get to that, let me talk just a little bit about the presidential proclamations. So on December 7th, Presidential Proclamation 2525 authorized the arrest and detention, as well as travel and property restrictions of individuals of Japanese ancestry living in the United States. And then the following day, the same was basically authorized to do the same to those of German and Italian ancestry. So you see here a poster by just 2 months after that, February 24th, 1942, they had to vacate certain areas. And the presidential proclamations were followed by executive orders. One of the most famous was Executive Order 9066, which was signed on February 19th, 1942, which defined the military areas where people could stay or leave, enter, stay, or leave, and then impose restrictions upon them. Then the Executive Order 9095 was signed on March 11th, 1942, which created the Office of Alien Property Custodian, which gave the custodian discretionary and plenary oversight of all alien property interests. So in other words, if you were a Japanese American and you had property on your farm or from your business or from your home, it could be given to somebody else. Unfortunately, some people took those belongings and never gave them back to them. Executive Order 9102 was signed on March 18th, 1942, which established the War Relocation Authority with Milton Eisenhower as director. Dwight D. Eisenhower was his brother, indeed, the general. Its purpose was to oversee the relocation and detention of Japanese Americans in particular. So let's then go to Crystal City, Texas. So during this time, in 1942, a lot of the Japanese were first put in detention areas. Sometimes they were at racetracks, like Santa Anita Racetrack outside of Los Angeles. And then they were transported to these various internment camps. A lot of Japanese Americans from Los Angeles went up to Manzanar. So they were, from various locales, were sent to certain internment camps. Crystal City would be a little bit different because a lot of the people who came there came from Latin America, so as well as from the United States. So it became a mix of German Americans, German Latin Americans, Germans, Italian Americans, Japanese, Japanese Peruvians, and Japanese American family interns. And they lived there from December 12th, 1942 to February 27th, 1948. Almost 4,751 lived there during the peak year of 1945. There were two sections, one for the Europeans, the German Americans, the Americans married to German nationals, Germans from Latin America, and Italian Americans and Italian nationals, and then one for the Japanese Americans and the Japanese Peruvians. The site included bungalows for families, schools, latrines, a warehouse, an auditorium, offices, officer housing, a basketball court, a pool, and a citrus orchard. The pool was unique. It was the only camp that had a pool. It was also used for irrigation, and it was a blessing because it was so hot. This Executive Order 9066, which I referenced in 2 slides ago, I just wanted to point out that it did allow for incarceration of all people, essentially anybody they felt who was part of the Axis powers, who was associated with them in any way. Did not list specific groups, however. One of the big problems, of course, was that there was inherent racism in the society, and it was difficult for the Japanese who were trying to make their living to overcome that. And you see here this sign, this is a grocery market, and it's Wanto Company, which is a Japanese name, and there's a big sign saying, "I'm an American," trying to overcome that racism, which was becoming problematic. But the real question was, why were there Germans, Italians, and Japanese coming from Latin America? It was to reduce the supposed threat to American interests within American borders, to have people to exchange with Axis powers for POWs and other American nationals, and to prevent economic rivalry with the United States, both for fear of profits to benefit Nazi Germany and to eliminate competition for US companies. So Germany in the prior 10 years to this point had been very active in establishing companies in Latin America. The United States did not like their presence there and did not want them to be a source of agitation or support for anybody who might want to resist against the United States. And as a countermeasure, FBI agents and others went down there and tried to identify anybody who would be against the United States and then decided to incarcerate them. So they literally pulled people from Latin America to put them into these internment camps. They came by boat, and it was not a pretty picture. They often ended up having to be disinfected. The boat rides were terrible, things like that. Fathers were usually brought into the camp first, and that was because the family was dependent on him, so they would often follow. As I mentioned, FDR and the government was concerned that there were pro-Nazi sympathizers who had spread Nazi propaganda in Latin America, which would also force the United States to focus attention on Latin America rather than Europe or the Far East. In fact, as historical research has proven, there was very little actual pro-Nazi activity down there. The transport ships were certainly overcrowded and unsanitary, and the Japanese from Peru were brought to Crystal City. They were brought usually to Algiers, Louisiana, to that detention center run by the INS, or Terminal Island in San Pedro, before getting on trains. So as I mentioned, one of the reasons why these people were interned was that, especially those who were German, Italian, or Japanese nationals, it could be used for exchange. And for the Japanese in particular, who had to fill out loyalty cards, if they said they were not loyal to the United States, they were immediately put on a list for repatriation. And even if their families disagreed with it, they had to go along with what the father said. Sometimes Germany wanted to have certain German citizens and families return, and in exchange, the United States could then request American citizens who could return from Europe. Families could be together at the camp if they agreed to possible repatriation. A total of 2,361 Americans behind enemy lines in Europe would eventually be exchanged for 4,500 Germans and 124 Italians who had been interned in the US camps. There were these camps, which were also for German and Italian nationals, and German and Italian nationals, and German and Italian Americans, but this was These were gender-specific camps here for men in these particular states. Crystal City was a family camp. Seagoville was a women's camp. And then, of course, there were the other camps for Japanese Americans. And these were some of the ones that you may have heard of: Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Jerome in Arkansas. So even though this was in California, it was on the eastern side of California. So most of these were very distant and isolated. These camps were run by War Relocation Authority, whereas these were run by the Justice Department. And they were considered more dangerous people in those internment camps than in others, which in the end was not true. Here is a picture of the famous swimming pool. And you see all sorts of barracks and offices as well. Here's a picture of German Americans living at the camp, and here they are smiling. If you ever read about people's actual feelings when they smiled, was that they were putting on a brave face. Living behind barbed wire is never a good thing. Here's a picture of Japanese Americans at a nursery school that was run by an internee. The Texas Historical Commission ran an oral history training workshop series, and in 2010, 2011, and a lot of these interviews were really quite fascinating. Here's one by Bessie Masuda, and it talks about how she grew up in a place in Central California called Lodi, how her father was taken away by the FBI. She was moved to first the Stockton Assembly Center and then to Arkansas before ending up at Crystal City. And she actually didn't know any Japanese, so she had to learn it. And that most of the other Japanese children that she met were Peruvian because they spoke Spanish. And she also talked about how one of her friends died in the swimming pool because her friend didn't know how to swim. Evidently there was a rope, and if you didn't hold on to it, it went into the deep end, and then that's how she and her friend died. So that really was a painful memory for Bessie. Here's a bird's eye view, and there you see the pool, there you see the orchard. It was really a large camp. So the people living in the camp definitely kept themselves busy. They were farming, they were teaching, they helped out in the medical office as nurses, there were beauticians, there were some doctors, workers, and they were paid, but very little. Milk was delivered, and the internees could either make food in their own homes or go to a communal dining hall. Here's another woman who has an interesting story. Her father was German, and she was born in London. Her mother was English, but her father was German. And they had been living in Venezuela and then Costa Rica. And then she had a little job, and she remembers talking about that in the camp. The housing was not great, but it was probably a little better than some of the other camps because they had some one-room buildings for childless couples or a couple with one child. They had 500 square foot 3-room cottages with indoor plumbing for larger families. They had duplexes, triplexes, and quadruple design barracks. And then they had some temporary housing, but they did not have air conditioning, which made for difficult times. So the housing for the workers, for the staff at the camp, was outside the fence. Inside, there were all sorts of things: food storage buildings, auditoriums, warehouses, administration office, a 70-bed hospital, places of worship, a post office, a bakery, a barbershop, a Japanese sumo wrestling ring, and a German beer garden. They also had 4 newspapers: the Crystal City Times, Juji Kai, Los Andes, and Das Lager, which represents the various languages being spoken, except for Italian. So the head of the camp was a man named J.J. O'Rourke. By all accounts, he was pretty friendly. Robert Clyde was the school system superintendent, had come from an area right outside of the camp in Texas. Besides the pool, they had soccer, baseball, tennis, basketball, volleyball, parties, games, cultural celebrations. recitals, dramas, musicals, and dances, even a high school prom that many parents refused to let their children attend. So I think we already talked about some of the meals, but they could certainly go to the dining hall or make their own food. Here's an interview with Haru Kuromaya, who was born in Riverside, and her family was at Manzanar before they were moved to Crystal City. Her father and uncle were in New Mexico. Her siblings and her mother were in Manzanar. And then she specifically mentioned that she remembers they cooked their own meals in their house, whereas in Manzanar, there was just the mess hall. There are different schools available: the American Federal School, the German School, and the Japanese School. And the federal high school students produced a yearbook called The Roundup and a school newspaper called the Campus Quill. So education was certainly available. As one of the interviews showed, some of them were beginning to learn Japanese at a very, they were much older and they had never learned Japanese. So what happened to all of these people who were put in these camps to be repatriated? Some did choose to go back to their home countries, and they felt that actually life would probably be better there. Many of them were in camp. They didn't actually believe what the Americans were saying, because of course they felt betrayed already for being put in this internment situation and being behind barbed wire and having armed guards watching them. So they weren't trusting whether or not what America said was true. So when they heard that, quote unquote, America won, some of them simply didn't believe that. And they felt that even with all that, that life in their home countries was probably better than what they had endured for the last 3 or 4 years in these camps. So the last German repatriation took place in December of 1945. The internees were put on a Swedish ship called the Gripsholm, which had been used many times for these exchanges for repatriation. And then the ship taking the Japanese to Japan, the Japanese Americans and the Japanese Peruvians, it's called the SS Masonia, and it left the port of Seattle on December 11th, 1945. I remember reading about a woman who said that when her family arrived in Japan and her father asked Japanese boatmen who came to pick them up from the boat whether Japan had won, and the man said, no, not at all, absolutely not, and people were begging, he was absolutely destroyed by that news, and that he sort of lost a piece of himself that day because he really thought that the Japanese had won and the Americans had been lying. So it was devastating in many ways. Here's another interview by a woman named Joanna Howell, who's born Wortman. She had been at Crystal City and gone back to Germany. And here's another one whose father thought it would be better, but it was worse. They had food rationing, no food, and they had nothing. And her mother was an American and the children were all American. And so they were really suffering there, but they all made it back to the United States eventually. But it was not an easy time to be living in the United States if you were one of these people who were subject to the attention of the immigration or the FBI or for any reason. And if they'd chosen repatriation, then it meant that they lived often in a place like Crystal City with the hope that they would be going back to a better situation. But it was hard because when they were originally put into the internment camps, they had gone through a pretty difficult process when they had been accused with very little evidence of being spies or being in favor of the Axis. No matter what they said, they were not really believed. Sometimes they had a hearing, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they were just sort of thrown into some sort of incarceration first before being moved to a camp. So you can imagine how a lot of these people really felt betrayed by the United States and wanted to go back. But when they got back to these home countries, often it was a very difficult situation. There was a lot of conflict as well because a lot of these families were mixed. There were children who were born in America and hadn't wanted to return. So there were a lot of issues involved with this whole internment at Crystal City. So thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something of interest and that you'll find it worthy and perhaps applicable to understand how people can feel like, how people make choices and why they feel like they should do that at some point.